Last week, Mr. Ash, I came up here to Atlanta to a little function for the Atlanta Public Library, a little gem up on the hill up here.
Yes.
And it's the good folks of Atlanta put together a little fundraiser. Very nice event. They had here a gentleman from Russia, Mikhail. Sorry about that, folks. Anyway, a noted celloist and a defector from Russia back in 1990. He was over here with the Russian musician group, touring the country, and the gentleman defected at a very young age. Is now a productive citizen of the United States, not an immigrant sitting back on green cards. Very, very entertaining, and it was a delightful evening. And so to the folks who put that on up here for the benefit of the public library, congratulations. It was really a real neat event. And Kathy Hieronymus apparently had known this gentleman when she was out in Virginia somewhere, and that's how he came to little Logan County, and they've kept a friendship down through the years, and so she was able to engineer that and bring him here. We found him a very, very entertaining guy, very affable, very, very articulate, and he's now playing with the Pittsburgh Symphony. Whether he's first chair or not, I don't remember. But nonetheless, and he did play a little bit, a young lady who's another Russian immigrant, by the way, who's now a student, a citizen, up at Illinois State. And she plays in one of our symphonic orchestras around here. And so she loaned her cello and brought it down. Oh. And all in all, very, very, very nice evening. So, kudos to those folks.
Most certainly.
Yeah. Did you have something about the Moors and
the Moors?
The ways of how we operate in this country? I gave you a little something that you might want a couple quotes out of there.
You gave me today.
Yes, there might be. This is a little profound, Mr. Beaver. Pay attention now in class.
Okay, food for thought. If you can get arrested for hunting or fishing without a license, but not for being in the country illegally, you might live in a country founded by geniuses, but run by idiots. Ooh, that's dirty.
Well,
if you have to get your parents' permission to go on a field trip or take an aspirin in school, but not to get an abortion, you might live in a country founded by geniuses, but run by idiots. If the only school curriculum allowed to explain how we got here is evolution, but the government stops a $15 million construction project to keep a rare spider from evolving to extinction, you might live in a country founded by geniuses, but run by idiots.
Well, that says about it all,
you remember when there was spotted owl?
A little light, but pretty profound.
Remember when the spotted owl was a big issue because they were in the forest and they were endangered species and they could become extinct? Well, they found that, I guess, that there was a junkyard, a car junkyard, like you see from time to time, nearby this area that was in question. And the owls loved nesting in the back shelf of the sedans because the sun would come through there and keep the eggs warm if they went out to Ladies' Aid or something,
Duh.
So,
Smart.
I don't know. I guess maybe then they decided that junkyards were an endangered species. I don't know what they did.
With political correctness to running amok the way it has, I think we're all an endangered species. Why don't you take a minute and introduce our guest this morning?
Well, I'd really like to. Professor Emeritus Paul Beaver, Lincoln
That means
College.
He's an old guy.
Yes, and Lincoln, America. And Paul, of course, is a noted Lincoln historian, and we're going to, ironically, be talking about Lincoln today. And he just reminded us that yesterday was not only election day, but it was also a notable day that I just sat here with the deer in the headlights look when he said, what was April 9th? I said, yesterday. So tell us what April 9th was.
Well, that was the day that Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, which essentially ended the Civil War. Ironically, you know, World War I, II ended, they signed the big armistice. Well, there was no signing of any armistice. The Civil War ended with Grant giving Lee a set of terms, such as your officers can keep their sidearms and horses, and we'll give you 25,000 rations and things. But it did not. And the men, once they stacked their arms and paroled them, they could go home. No prisoner of war camps, no...
Well, they had
Pretty
them,
chaotic.
though,
Oh, yes.
to the
It
max.
had to be really very chaotic.
They were, you know, Lee thought himself that he would be Grant's prisoner and thought there'd be a trial, and there were some members of Congress that did want to try all of the leaders of the Confederacy. After all, it was a rebellion. But Grant just stopped all of that.
Being the smart man that he is, or was.
And sent it home, you know, sent everybody home. And then Johnson surrendered right after Lincoln's death. And then they finally surrendered in Texas. Jefferson Davis was trying to reach these other armies. He wanted to keep on fighting, but they caught him down in Irwinsville, Georgia, and that was the end of that.
Yeah.
They did lock him up for about a year. He was the only... Well, and one person was executed, the commandant of Andersonville prison.
Oh.
His name was Worse. He was tried and convicted and hanged.
Was he a despot, or...
He probably paid the penalty for several of the other commanders. They had no food. They had no food for the army, so they'd just go out and cut green corn and throw it over the fence there at Andersonville for the troops. And a good share of those died.
Yes.
And it was pretty horrific. So then the North retaliated by not feeding them, you know, not taking care of the Confederate prisoners. And, pretty horrible situation. You get 620,000 deaths. They came from all walks of the war, and it's such an ironic thing that Lincoln is killed just right after Appomattox. It's 6 days later on the 14th, evening of the 14th. He's the final Civil War casualty.
Mm-hmm.
I think a good many, they say Lee wept. They said when General Sherman told Joe Johnson, commander of the other big Confederate army, they were in the process of surrendering. And Sherman told him what had happened to Lincoln, and Johnson said, "Oh, words to this effect, we may have lost our best friend." He knew he knew things were going to get bad after that. And he was right.
And they got bad, and they never get better. Honestly, this business of studying war, what a futile, awful thing that a couple people can get torqued with one another, and you've got a war. Now look, we were just talking in the car on the way up. Now we've got North Korea. What's this going to be? Deja vu all over again? We never learn.
Yeah, we were just talking about my best friend's brother-in-law. They're going to go out on the we call honors flight bill. I know you've been on, and
Yes.
and he was a Korean veteran, and how I think it's going to affect him when he sees that memorial. But that was a foot war. That was Chesty Puller taking him out of the Pusan, Chosun Reservoir, and things like that. That was a foot war. That's past. I don't see boats taking troops to Korea again, ever again. Do you, Bill? I don't see that.
No.
You're the military man in our bunch here.
Unfortunately, I don't think there's ever going to be a time when we're going to see unrest somewhere in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I particularly am concerned about that Israeli situation. That's such a tinderbox over there in that part of the world. As we speak, that could go up. I think that's more likely to go up than the Korean situation. But nonetheless, we're not. I don't have enough smarts to ponder over that.
It took us a few years to get over the Civil War. It took a few years for that, and we really stayed divided north and south for a good long time. When you think about it, people didn't vacation in Florida and down on the Gulf Coast and all that for a long time. That's been a real recent moving back and forth of
I just sold my Confederate money the other day. I decided the South's not going to rise again. So.
And don't vote for
I
Wallace.
remember my grandfather, he had a different view of the South. Well, who would go south? I mean, it's warmer down there. Well, they didn't think about that back when I was a little kid. And think about that. That was the South. Different world, remember?
Paul, at what point in time in your career as a student did you decide that this is the tangent on which you wish to go? Particularly, you started your master's thesis. Is that about the time when you decided that you had a real, or sometime in your earlier career, somebody had kind of tripped to go to wire up there somewhere to pique an interest in the war and Abraham Lincoln?
I think that, I was going to say that today, that I think the Lincoln interest came because we're talking about the funeral train going to come through Lincoln and so on in 2 years of the recreation. And my uncle, who was always, he was a World War I veteran, and he always told me this story that he said, your grandfather always said he was there when the Lincoln funeral train came through. Well, I finally looked it up, and I said, wait a minute. I said, can't be. Grandpa was born June 9th, 1865, and the train came through a month earlier. My uncle had waited for years for me to do that, and he patted his stomach. He said, well, he was there. Your great-grandmother was very pregnant with your grandfather, and they just loved that. He was waiting to tell me that story.
I guess you're there, vicariously.
But the story was that they'd gotten in the wagon where we lived out there at Lucas Chapel and rode to the railroad tracks south of town, between just a little bit north of where the prison road is today, and watched the funeral train go by and paid their respects, as did several families in Logan County, which I'm thinking about see if we can get our family maybe to reenact that when the train comes through 2 years from now. So that's how I started being interested in Lincoln.
Let's address that just a minute. We talked about that outside the studio. Is there a timetable on this? Is this on the planning boards for this train?
They plan to recreate the journey, and they're building the engine, the replica of the engine that carried, which is a steam engine, of course, much smaller than today. And they're planning to build the carriages, and 2 years from now, it's going to be a logistic nightmare, I think, for the railroads, but it's going to come through Chicago, and of course then his body lay in state up there for a day or two, and then came down our tracks where they still are today. Actually, the tracks are almost identical to where they were. Came through Atlanta early in the morning. Sun was rising, and then came through Lincoln. It traveled through those towns about 3 miles an hour, and people had, and then through Elkhart, had a wreath over the tracks with different slogans on them. And then the churches, many of the churches, choirs and different groups organized and came and sang hymns as the train went through town. Many people said prayers. And then, of course, out along the tracks as it went on to Springfield, a lot of people came in.
I guess out in the countryside, people lined the tracks.
Lined the tracks in the country also.
How many cars were there in that train, Paul? And will there be the same amount
probably the
this
same.
time?
I think 3, maybe 3 or 4, something like that. Of course, the car that carried his body, they had for years, and it ended up in Minnesota, if I remember correctly, and a grass fire burned it up. So they lost the original, but they had, different dignitaries, and the soldiers stood at the end of the train. They really didn't have any problems. They didn't have to guard anything. It just was an honor. But 3 miles an hour, pretty slow. Try to drive your car 3 miles an hour.
I've driven behind some people like that.
So then they lined up, and I think, certainly for us, we got 2 years to think about it, but in the town, the first name for him and christened by him, and I think we've got to make sure because we're going to be the last stop, and I say stop, rolling stop, before Springfield, where the big hullabaloo will be, because everything happened in Springfield, right?
Now, who's behind this? What's the driving force behind
Well,
this?
I think it came out of the bicentennial, when we had the bicentennial there a few years ago, and came out to Washington. And, you know, and I'm not really sure who's putting up the money. I don't think the government's putting up much of it as usual.
I
I don't
don't
have anything
think
put up,
not.
I suppose. But,
Although it could take some from... Never mind, Bill.
But but the train, once they get
Fair and
that
honest.
built, it would be, they could exhibit that for years. You know, I don't know where, but they could, that would really be cool anytime that, but it is a one-time thing, that the engine was decked out in the car, and but thousands of people did. I mean, people came from all over, and it was like going for visitation. That's what my uncle always said, that his, my grandfather, who I never met, said that his folks said it was that they went to Lincoln's visitation along the tracks. So you think about it, and then when it was, the body was at the State House in Springfield, there wasn't anybody to visit with. Robert didn't visit with people, or Mary wasn't in any shape to visit with people. Tad was still small, and you know, just a little fellow when his dad died. If you've seen the Lincoln movie, you know where he was watching Aladdin when they told him, when he heard his dad had been killed.
You and Ron discussed, we came to that seminar at the college on the campus there. You and Ron discussed the movie. Would you recount for us your opinion of how that was done, and your personal reactions versus your professional opinions?
Well, I think both of us were pleasantly surprised that they were as accurate as they were. It's tough for a filmmaker, evidently, to stay with what really happened when they're so tempting to move over here and there and make it a little more spectacular or glamorous. But we were both surprised that they stayed pretty much down the line with it. I mean, for example, talking about Tad. Tad was watching the performance of Aladdin when that news was brought in. That really happened. The thing is that they didn't show the assassination. I thought that was interesting. They just said it happened. But Daniel Day-Lewis really caught Lincoln. He spent a lot of time. They said he spent
Obviously
a
so.
lot of time studying it. And any little thing where somebody would say, you know, Lincoln really walks peculiar. He picked his foot up and put it down. He didn't, kind of that, the way farmers used to say farmers walk that way through a wet field.
I was going to say they did that because they were in the field.
That's right.
For that.
And that's the way he walked. And that last scene when he walks out, he caught that, I think, really well. And I think his speech, he didn't have Raymond Massey's deep voice. He had a penetrating voice, which allowed him to speak to these crowds. And really, in some ways, what did Douglas in. Douglas had that deeper voice and eventually died, I believe, of throat cancer.
Oh, you mentioned Raymond Massey. Wasn't he in town sometime eons ago?
I think so.
I believe he
I
was,
think he- I
yes.
think
There's
he
some
was.
Lincoln thing, and Raymond Massey was here, and I can't remember the details.
I thought, you know, there's been the more modern performances of Lincoln been pretty good, but when he sat there, I thought if any kid wants to study Lincoln and want to know what he looked like, that's about as close as they're going to get. And the makeup and telling jokes in the middle of crises, that just drove Secretary of War Stanton, as you saw in the movie, just drove him. You're not going to tell another story. Yes, I am. And he said, I have to do that. I have to do that to survive. You know, I've got to break this somehow. So he'd tell a story. And
So Lincoln scholars in general felt that
I think Pleasant-
Hollywood didn't put too much Hollywood in the...
No.
Now,
I think the slapping of Robert, most of us think that probably would never happen because Lincoln never raised his hand to his kids. That's part of the reason they acted the way they did, I think. He never punished them. I mean, if you got goats that pulling chairs around in the White House, you know, somebody might say something, but he never did. He thought it was funny.
well, the reason I mentioned the Hollywood emphasis on that thing is I was speaking with somebody yesterday, asked me if I'd watched the series on the Bible. And as I said to her, I said, I asked my brother that, and he says, I read the book.
Oh, dear.
That's a good one.
Apropos what Jess, by the way, that's Paul's brother-in-law.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, right. I thought, and I didn't watch the whole thing, I watched the first night, and my take, and I'd like, if somebody has another opinion, the 648-5510, you know, I'd like to discuss that a little bit with you. Don't want to get off the subject matter, but I frankly thought that there was too much Hollywood in it.
Now, where are we, on Lincoln or the Bible?
No, we're on the Bible. We're in
Okay.
the Bible series. No, I thought the other thing, not being a Lincoln student, but I thought that was very, very well done.
Well, they always
I thought the
said-
Bible thing was overdone. Now, I'd just like to have some other opinions.
Well, I've had people say that the hardest two roles to play are Christ and Lincoln.
Well, yeah.
Just so that for Danny Day-Lewis, they should have gotten the Academy Award because he really caught the man. I never thought it'd be possible. I think most of us who studied Lincoln thought, well, let's see what this is going to be. It's going to be Raymond Massey or Henry Fonda or whatever we're going to get. And none of that. When you sat there and watched him, and you think sometimes that, yeah.
Well, he'd worked hard at
Yes,
getting
he
into
did.
the character. There's no question about that.
And the times with anger, and then the scene with Mary, that had to be a tough one too, because how did it just? She just.
And speaking
she
of
had
working
a terrible
hard,
time.
Well, I should think she would. I
terrible time.
defy anybody to say that you'd go through it singing and tripping through the
Well,
wildflowers.
particularly after she lost Willie, I just did her in. I mean, Lincoln walked her to the window in the White House over there, what we in those days was called an insane asylum, and said, "Mother, you know, you got to get straightened out, or you're going to end up over here." I mean, but there's a scene in that movie though that really catches the problem. She's talking to him. Do you remember this very serious situation? And they come and knock on the door. They're bombing William, what's a place down there in Carolina, and he just. That's the end of the conversation with her, and he's out the door. And same with Robert. Many a night, he would go over to Secretary of State's Seward's house, many a night, and talk with him about the war, and are we doing right, and I'm sure they talk constantly about generals. One of my favorite stories is that after I think it was Chancellorsville, which was a disaster, and Hooker, who told Lincoln, or told everybody, they just let me be a dictator, basically, I'll win this. And Lincoln said, you win the battles, I'll risk the dictatorship.
Yeah.
But Hooker just, it was a disaster. Lee just almost annihilated the Union Army. And
Well, he had other things on his mind, Paul.
what the thing about it is, the story that's so great is that Lincoln goes into the cabinet meeting, and everybody is saying to him, you got to get rid of Hooker. You've got to get rid of Hooker. We're all agreed. And Lincoln said, all right, okay, we'll get rid of Hooker. Who do I replace him with? And their answer was, anybody will do. And Lincoln's answer is perfect. Anybody will do for you. Me, I need a name.
Uh-huh.
Think about that one.
Yeah. But that cuts to the chase. And we're going to have to cut to the chase, by golly. We're going to have to cut for a commercial break right now. Mr. Ash?